Hello dear learner, I welcome you to the lecture 5 of week 3 which is titled Jügen Habermas, and this is continuation of lecture 4 of week 3. Now in this lecture the concepts which will be covered are: first the concept of constitutional state, then the notion of procedural democracy, third is the notion of deliberative politics, then what we understand by weak and strong publics, and the last is what is the notion of the cosmopolitan democracy. So, let us first begin with the notion of constitutional state as understood or determined by Jürgen Habermas. Now, actually Habermas talks about the principles of constitutional state across two dimensions, and we know that the meaning of constitutional state means a state which runs according to a constitution, the written rules. Now, these two dimensions are: first is the generation of communicative power, and second is the exercise of that power through the administrative power. So, he talks about the two types of power. The first is the communicative power and second is the administrative power. Now, in other words, in a constitutional state, the law is generated from communicative power and the latter in turn is converted into administrative power via the legitimately enacted law. So, you can see there is a interrelationship between the generation of a legitimate law, then communicative power, and third is the administrative power, or you can say they are the three corners of a triangle which are connected with each other. And the connection is in this form, that any legitimate law has to be framed or formulated through the means of communicative power or through the means of communicative action or through the means of deliberation. And for any communicative power to turn into administrative power, it has to be done through a properly or through a legitimately enacted law. So, how the three cornerstones of a constitutional state have been highlighted by Habermas. The notion of communicative power is identified with realization of rational public opinion and will formation in the process of law making. So, law making is not something which is to be done by a certain selected group of people sitting at the topmost hierarchy or the topmost echelons of the society, but it is to be done or to be realized through the formulation of public opinion and through the formation of will by all the people in a society. So, basically the process of law making is nothing but realization of rational public opinion and will formation. Now, connecting the notion of rule of law with popular sovereignty, Habermas said that power can be exercised only through the medium of law, which derives from communicative modes of action. So, sovereignty or the supreme law or the supreme power, it can be exercised only through the medium of law, and that law which is legitimate and which derives from the communicative mode of action, which means through the means of deliberation and through the means of discussion and by the use of reason and rationality, where the people they deliberate and they discuss and they come to a consensus on certain issues which matters them. So, the process of law making is not to be done by a selected group of person, but to be done by the public or the people through a certain process. Now, connecting rule of law with the notion of popular sovereignty, which is very obvious, Habermas said that power can be exercised only through the medium of law which derives from the communicative mode of action. So, it is very clear that if we want to connect the formulation of law with the notion of popular sovereignty or the rule of the people, or you can say the concentration of supremacy or power in the hands of the people, then naturally we have to give the power of decision making, or we have to take into consideration the opinion of the people in the formulation of laws. So, therefore, he has rightly said, rule of law is connected with the rule by the people. So, rule of law can actually be operationalized if there is rule by the people. So, both are connected with each other, and the rule of the people must be based on rule of law. They are actually two sides of the same coin. One is the rule of law and second is the rule by people. So, rule by law, when we say, it is not the rule of law, but it is actually the rule of people through law. And when we say that, how this law is formulated? This law is formulated through the communicative mode of action. So, they both actually are two sides of the same coin. Now, Habermas also explained the process by which the citizens will engage in the process of law creation, because ultimately when you are connecting the formulation of law with the notion of popular sovereignty, we have to also delineate the process by which the people play their role in the formulation of laws. And this, he suggests, is done by the process of the procedural democracy. Now, we know that in common parlance, we make a distinction between two types of democracy. One is the procedural democracy, one is the substantive democracy. Now, the procedural democracy talks about the procedures or the right means or the following of certain norms or certain rules to achieve certain goals. The goals are not important or the final outcome is not important. The use of procedures or the following of procedures or processes are more important, and they should be fair and they should be equitable, they should not make any discrimination, etc. When we talk about the substantive notion of democracy, here only on procedures, but also on the outcome of democracy or outcome of any policy or processes, because we have seen that there are many circumstances where we have followed the right procedures, but the outcome has been unequal, where the outcome has not been beneficial to certain segments of the society. So, we have to analyze whether the democracy is able to achieve the substance or objectives for which it is operating. It may be justice or it may be the equitable distribution of resources in the society or attainment of certain freedoms, etc. So, again coming back to the Habermas notion of procedural democracy, which involves the realization of rights of public and private autonomy through certain institutions. So, it is not only the rights which are enjoyed by the people in the public sphere, but also the rights which are enjoyed by the people in the private sphere, or you can say their own individual rights, and also their right to deliberate about government policies or their right to deliberate about certain issues or problems in the society. And these rights can be achieved through certain institutions, because institutionalization of these rights or the institutions which are available for the application for the procedural democracy is also equally important, and that has been underlined or stressed upon by Habermas when he is talking about the procedural notion of democracy. Now, this notion of the procedural democracy, as underlined by Habermas, it includes the best feature of the liberal notion of democracy and also the republican notion of democracy. Now, we must just understand in brief what the liberal notion of democracy does and underlines, and actually what does the republican notion of democracy does or underlines. And then we will see that which notions of both liberal and the republican tradition has been rejected by Habermas, and what notion or what elements have been accepted by Habermas. Now, first let us consider the liberal model. Now, we know that the liberal notion of democracy gives emphasis to self-interest, individual rights, liberty, then private property and limited state. Now, we have studied liberalism in political science, where primary importance is given to individual rights, because every individual possesses the reason or rationality which also forms the basis of the promotion of his self-interest. And this promotion of self-interest, it guides or motivates individual thoughts and actions. And since the ideology of liberalism, it rose in reaction to the medieval era or the medieval various practices which were oppressive to individual and the rights. We know that in the medieval era there was no notion of individual, there was no notion of individual rights or democracy. So, the abstraction of individual, or you can say emancipation of individual, was the most important achievement of liberalism. And therefore, the liberal democracy talked about giving civil and political rights to the individual and to ensure that individuals' rights are not discriminated or interfered upon by the state. Then another very important feature was the notion of liberty, because liberty constitutes the primary focus or unit of liberalism, because it talks about the liberty of the individual. Even the state has come into being to protect the right and liberty of the individual. So, liberty is a prime focus. And then the notion of private property, because without having certain property, an individual cannot develop his own self. He cannot get the motivation to work, and there are various theories in liberalism which justifies or gives reasons why there is need for having right to private property. And therefore, the related concept is the limited state or the night watchman state. Because if we read the classical liberal notion, where it has been clearly mentioned that the role of the state should be as limited as possible, it should be limited to the night watchman state, or in other words, its role should be actually being limited to maintenance of law and order, and all other spheres of life should be left completely independent in the hands of the individual. State has no right to interfere in making choices or in terms of making decisions by individual about the various aspects of their life. So, we can see that all these terms or features of the liberal state are interrelated with each other, and they have also influenced the notion of capitalism, which is an economic extension of political liberalism. So, therefore, it is very obvious that the liberal have given more importance to individual rights and the limited state, though in the modern notion of liberalism we have seen that in response to the rise of Marxism and the criticism of the abstract individual notion of rights, they have made certain transformation and changes in their ideas, and they have incorporated the notion of welfare state. But welfare state, though it is talking about social and economic rights along with the civil and political rights, but still it is talking about the liberty of the individual. The prime focus is individual and not the community. Whereas the Republican model talks about freedom as non-domination. It talks about civic virtues and active political participation. What we mean by freedom as non-domination? Because if you remember the liberal notion of liberty, it talks about freedom from interference. Now, we are talking about freedom from interference. It means that nobody should interfere in my right or in my autonomous sphere or in my ability to take certain decisions or make certain choices. But it does not mean that if somebody is not interfering in my life or in my private sphere, it does not mean that the chances of domination are not in existence. The Republican notion, they argue that their notion of freedom is very different from the liberal notion of both the positive freedom and especially the negative notion of freedom. They argue that simply freedom from interference is not enough. Freedom from those conditions or those possibilities which can create a sort of chances of domination or the probabilities of domination should also be taken into account. So, a person, the Republican notion, they have explained it with the help of an example, that suppose there is a case of a master and a slave, and if the master is very good natured, then the slave can enjoy a lot of autonomy, he can enjoy freedom because he is well treated by his master, and the master has given him all freedom to exercise his rights. He gives him all resources, all materials and proper payment, and he is very happy with his life and also with his master. So, in fact, if you go by the liberal notion of non-interference, then we find that here the master is not interfering in the rights of the slave, and therefore, the slave is enjoying all the freedom. He is exercising his right from all type of interference. But what about a condition or a future probability where the master becomes dominant, where the master turns evil and tries to snatch away the freedom and all the resources and privileges which are enjoyed by the slave? Then under such conditions, what will the slave do? Because the chances of the master turning from a good master to a bad master is always there. So, to reduce all the probabilities of domination, to eliminate all structures of domination is what we understand by the republican notion of freedom as non-domination. Then another very important thing which is highlighted by the republicans is the notion of civic virtues. Because in order to have a strong state, in order to have a healthy state, it is very essential that the people who constitute the state or the citizens, they are educated with certain civic virtues like honesty, sincerity, or devotion to duty, or love for their nation, or patriotism. These are certain civic virtues which actually makes a nation strong, which makes a nation get truly successful in all its endeavors. And the last is active political participation, because you know that if the people do not participate, then the notion of democracy is having no meaning, or it is having very less value or less importance. It is the participation of people at multiple levels. It is not simply a contesting election or participating in the process of voting, but it also means that ability to participate in the decision making, ability to influence the policies and programs of the government. They are talking about active political participation. Now, Habermas have rejected the liberal notion of politics as an arena of competition and pursuit of private interest. He has completely rejected it. He said that politics has been reduced to only a pursuit of self-interest, or you can say vested interest, or pursuit of power. Instead of a competitive politics, there is need for cooperative politics. Also, he found unacceptable the republican shared unified vision of good life by citizenry, because he believed that there cannot be one shared notion of good life, because today we are living in a pluralistic society with different communities, so much of diversities, and people speaking different language, having different culture, having different history. How we can have a shared vision of good life? So, when we are talking about a shared vision of citizenry, that also is not very practical, because we are living in a diverse society. So, Habermas has raised objections, or he has raised questions about such notion of democracy. Therefore, finally, he argued that his notion of the procedural democracy has to be deliberative in nature. Now, the deliberative politics is a view of the political process that promotes the search for reasoned agreement about the citizens' common good. You see, I am again repeating reasoned agreement which has come out of certain deliberations, and that deliberations have been done or undertaken through the means of reason and rationality. And the objective of that argumentation based on reason is to achieve certain common good. So, that is a deliberative process. So, any sphere of politics should be deliberative in nature, where the people are continuously participating in discussions, they are participating in the policy making, they are participating in the argumentation, etc. For this, there is need for institutionalization of procedures and conditions of communication, as well as interplay of institutionalized the deliberative process with informally constituted public opinion. So, in this line you can see that there are multiple dimensions which he has underlined in order to have the proper working of the procedural democracy. The first, he talks about institutionalization of procedures. Now, only procedures are not enough. There should be certain institutions, whether parliament or judiciary or executive or some other body, which are actually responsible to make these procedures operational. Then there are certain conditions of communication, like the free flow of information, ability to express one's opinion, etc. And the third is interplay of institutionalized deliberative process with informally constituted public opinion. So, the public opinion is informal in nature, it is not formally constituted, it is informal in nature, and those which are institutional structures or bodies of the deliberative decision making, there should be proper linkages or interaction between both the institutionalized forms of the deliberative process and the informal processes of deliberation, which are in the form of the opinion which are held by the people. Now, there should be coordination and there should be some sort of a communication or a two-way process should be there between these two elements. Now, the objective of deliberative politics is to ensure that the public opinion is formed on the basis of adequate information and relevant reasons. So, basically the objective of deliberative politics is to ensure that the people, they should strive to build certain opinion on issues which are of their common interest, and they should formulate these opinion based on right information or true information and also with the help of reason. So, these are two essential conditions, the two essential parameters to ensure that the deliberative process is taking place in a proper manner. Now, those whose interests are involved have an equal and effective opportunity to make their own interests known. So, it is basically he is talking about the stakeholders. Anybody who is having a stake in a certain policy or in certain decisions or in certain programs, they have the right to express their opinion. They have the right to say that their interests are not getting recognized or they can ask for the protection of their interest. So, he said that anybody who is having a stake in certain policy or certain common goods, they have the right to make their interest known. Now, Habermas' notion of deliberative politics extends beyond formal political system like parliament to informal political public sphere that includes informal channels of political communication. So, we can say that the notion of deliberative politics as highlighted or as explained by Habermas is a much expansive term. It includes not merely the formal or the institutionalized processes or structures of democracy like parliament or judiciary or executive, but also to those informal channels in the public sphere where there is continuous flow of communication or there exists lots of opinion which has to be taken into consideration. So, both formal and informal channels of communication, they constitute important aspects of the deliberative politics. His model of deliberative politics is a two-track process in which there is division of labor between weak publics and strong publics. Now, he has introduced a new concept which is weak public and strong public. Now, weak public sphere includes informal institutions like private bodies, mass media, etc. And strong public includes parliamentary bodies and other formally organized institutions of political system. As we can say that because the parliamentary bodies and other formally organized structures, they are formally organized, they are properly institutionalized. So, he has termed them as strong publics. Whereas, weak publics he has basically included in it informal organizations like private bodies, it can be some clubs, it can be some organizations or institutions, and he has also included mass media in this category of weak public. Weak public is concerned with addressing social problems, whereas strong public is aimed at making decisions. Because weak public means it is ultimately the people or the public who can formulate their own problems, who can actually explain that what they need and what is their interest. So, they help in the formulation of the social problem, whereas the formal institutionalized structures of democracy, they are involved in the process of decision making. So, whatever problems are coming to them, They are converted into certain solutions by developing certain laws or programs or policies by this institutionalized structure, or what Habermas has called as strong publics. Secondly, he suggested that the radical democratic practice must assume a self-limiting form. This means that the process of democratization is not focused on society as a whole, but on the legal system. Now, Habermas has also talked about a cosmopolitan notion of democracy. So, it is not simply the procedural democracy at the state level, but also at the cosmopolitan level, that include a reformed and strengthened United Nation, including a world parliament. Now, his two-track model of democracy can be applied at the global level also. His idea of weak public sphere can be called global civil society, as we have talked in the context of the civil society of a particular state, and the strong public can be the formal institutions of decision making at multi-layered and dispersed conception of sovereignty, because unlike state, we know that the sovereignty is dispersed at the international level, at the regional level, and then at the local level. So, therefore, he advocated multi-level federal system consisting of three global actors. First is the supranational political body, which is limited to maintenance of peace and protection of rights, like we now have of the United Nations, and the regional bodies, which is devoted to global domestic politics. We have a couple of regional bodies across the world, and the third is the nation state, which constitutes a basic unit of the international political system. Now, with that I come to the end of this lecture, and like other slides, I have given certain activity questions which are based on the understanding and the topics which we have covered in this lecture. The first is explain the relationship between law, then communicative and administrative power. Then what is the notion of procedural democracy? What is Habermas' notion of deliberative politics? Explain the difference between weak and strong publics. What is cosmopolitan democracy? And at the last, I have given you certain statements and questions which I want that you should think upon them, like first is think about two examples of deliberative politics in the present times. Now, think of a possible structure of a cosmopolitan democracy, or you can make a visualization that if we have a notion or a structure of the cosmopolitan democracy, then what will be the possible structure or probable structure of such a democracy? Then what is the role of mass media in the formation of public opinion? Do you think that it is based on reasons? And this is very relevant, especially in the contemporary times where mass media is manipulating our opinions, our choices. So, we have to decide that what role mass media is playing in the formation of public opinion, and are those formation of public opinion are based on reason or not. So, these are certain statements, or you can say food for thought for you. With this, I come to the end of this lecture, and thank you very much.